And I would like to talk with you a little bit more specific on germ theory itself, and why exactly it is not the cause of the disease, and your perspective on what causes disease in humans and what we historically mistake with contagion. So if it's not virus, for example, or not even a bacteria, as many of my viewers know already, what is it? What is the mechanism that you think?
Right. Well, so there's kind of two things to parse out here, because one is that we have germ theory, which is the theory that puts forth that, these microscopic organisms that we call germs, and by the way, that word itself is problematic, invade our bodies and cause the disease. And so if we were to test that, we would want to, just look at some actual experiments and see what do they show. So, for example, we would know that, if the bacteria, for example, causes a disease, it would have to always be present when that disease was present, right? However, if we look at something like tuberculosis, many times the bacteria that they say causes tuberculosis is not present in patients that have tuberculosis. So how is that possible? It doesn't make sense. But if you look back even further, what's the first evidence that led them to even think about this possibility? Well, here's what it was. After the microscope was invented and scientists started looking through it and saw that there were these microscopic organisms. They were, previously unknown because they're invisible to the naked eye. But under the microscope, there's a whole new world. So they would examine the tissue of people who were sick. And lo and behold, they would see these microorganisms present. And they made the assumption that since they were present, they were the cause of the illness. But, an example that many people have pointed out is if you were looking at the explanation of what causes a house fire, and you went and observed house fires, you would see firefighters there, right? Almost every time. So would you conclude that firefighters caused the house fire? No, you wouldn't, right? You would have to do further research to determine if that were the case, like maybe observe places before the fire started and see were the firefighters there when the fire started, for example, right? That would be one way you could tell. So when they tried to do further experiments like this, they really were unable to show that the germ was always present in people who were sick. And further, they couldn't show that the germ wasn't present in people who weren't sick. And an example that we may all be familiar with of this would be like strep throat, because streptococcus, the bacteria that we're told causes that illness, is actually present in all of us pretty much. And if we just did throat cultures of, 10,000 healthy people, we'd find a lot of them would culture out streptococcus, but it wouldn't correlate with them being sick. And we know that it's a bacteria that normally lives on your body. So there were some experiments that were claimed to show that germ theory was true, but they were actually plagiarized. So we know about some of Pasteur's experiments were like this. And then there were many experiments that disproved the germ theory, but they weren't widely publicized. Once sort of Rockefeller medicine came into play through the Flexner report in the United States and the whole development of the allopathic health system, which became the dominant mode of providing health and relying on pharmaceuticals, it was largely based on this germ theory. Now, the other theory, which has much more validity experimentally, has been really downplayed, but it's actually something that we're all familiar with in the modern era. And what I would call this is terrain theory. And what it proposes is that the microorganisms actually respond to another cause of the illness, and they help clean up the mess, essentially, just like we see microorganisms in nature, that they degrade and break down decaying and dying biological matter. So, like tree leaves and limbs that fall to the forest floor, for example, or when an animal dies for whatever reason, whatever the scavengers don't get, the microorganisms will break it down. And this is a important recycling function in nature because it then takes that material and puts it into its constituent components so it can be used by other organisms. Like it breaks it down into minerals, right, and amino acids and things like that other animals can and plants can use to sort of recycle nature. So it's really a wonderful thing. And we know about this from the microbiome, which has been talked about so much in the last decade. And that we have all kinds of people actually taking bacteria as a supplement, right? All of these probiotics that are very commercially successful, that's what they are. So we know that we need these microorganisms to be healthy, but that notion is really at odds with the germ theory, which says that these microorganisms invade us and make us sick. And they can't both be correct because they're the opposite of each other, so to speak. But really, the evidence supports the terrain theory. So, for example, when people have tried to take a pure bacteria, like there was a famous professor, and this is described in the book Virus Mania by Torsten Engelbrecht et al., that was teaching microbiology. And every year when he had a new group of students, he would take a pure culture of the cholera bacteria, Vibrio cholera, that they say causes that, awful disease, a version of dysentery. And he would swallow it right in front of his class. And of course, he never got sick because that's not the cause of the illness.
And I'm just going to finish with one more thing, which I like to, is a quote from Rudolf Steiner. And by the way, this was around 1917. So it was a different time. In times when there were no electrical currents, when the air was not swarming with electrical influences, we're talking 1917, it was easier to be human. For this reason, in order to be human at all today, it is necessary to expend much stronger spiritual capacities than was necessary a century ago. So I'll just leave you with whatever you can do to increase your spiritual capacities, because it's really damn hard to be human being these days.